So far, you have learned how to create functions and send them information using their parameters. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to create functions that return values. This is particularly useful if you're doing some kind of calculation in your function and you want to return the result to whoever is using your function. Let me show you. So let's start by defining a function called square. This function simply calculates the square of a number. So we need to add one parameter here, that is our number. Now here we want to calculate number times number. That is the square of a number. Now to return this number outside of this function, we simply use the return statement. So return. Now our square function is very simple. It only has one line of code. But in a real program, you might have a function that has 10 lines of code to calculate something. So this return statement is very valuable. With that, we can return values to the callers of our function. So with this, when we call the square function, let's say we give it 3. Now this function returns a value, just like the input function of Python. This input function waits for the user to type something and press enter, and then it will return the user's input as a string. So we can get it and store it in a variable like this, right? We have the same story with our square function. So our square function returns a value. We can simply get it and store it in a variable. Let's call that result. Now we can print result on the terminal. There you go. So result is 9. We could also pass this function call directly inside of the print function without defining a separate variable. Sometimes this is useful for writing shorter code. So in this case, we don't really need this result variable. We simply want to print the square of 3. So we could simply pass this function call right here as an argument for the print function. So let's delete this variable. Now our code is shorter. So with this, we're calling the square function. This returns a value, and we'll pass that value as an argument to the print function. Okay? When we run this program, we get the exact same result. There you go. Now, what happens if we don't use a return statement in our function? So in the last example, we simply used a print statement. Let's temporarily remove this return statement and print the result on the terminal like this. So let's run our program one more time and see what we get. We get two things on the terminal, the number 9 and none. What is happening here? Well, when Python interpreter executes this code, first it will call the square function. So the control moves to the square function. Here we calculate the square of this given number and then print it on the terminal. That is the reason we see 9 right here. Now, by default, all functions return the value none. So if we don't have a return statement here, by default, Python returns none. None is an object that represents the absence of a value. It's like nothing, or null in C, C++, Java, and JavaScript. So in this example, we didn't have a return statement, and by default, Python returned none from this function. So after this square function is executed, the value none is returned and passed as an argument to the print function. That is the reason we see none on the second line. So here are the two things you need to take away from this tutorial. By default, all functions in Python return none. You can change that. So if you have a function that calculates something, you can return the result using the return statement.